briefly recap, the Greeks has a deeply hidden agenda which has been influenced by some pre-September 11th neoconservatives who are associated with the project for a new American century. The obvious messages come in the traditional forms of making the enemy look as bad as possible and the good guys as good as can be. What is not so easily seen is the series misogyny, and how that works with some other cynical elements to cut down the value of the arts and imagination. By undermining the feminine, the production upholds their ultimate aim of undercutting intelligence, takes away a means of using one's mind, and glorifies a mechanical world which, as you know, is the best possible world for making huge corporate profits at the expense of Mother Earth and all her children. During the course of the program, viewers are told precious little about women in those ancient days. Of course, this three-part series was not meant to be a study of those women, or the status of slaves, or that quaint antique practice of pederasty. The writings of the late James Hillman, who was a depth psychologist and for part of his career had been director of studies at the C.G. Jung Institute in Zurich, have strongly influenced my thinking, especially the three essays in his book, The Myth of Analysis. Depth psychology follows from Jung and his ideas of the archetypes. I presume to mention this because I hope to demonstrate here that when we are talking about women, we aren't talking only about social status, class, or economic opportunities, though all of these concerns are real and will grow in importance during our time of the long war.
Hiding is very dangerous indeed.
Come on, fire!
This video, filmed from the cockpit of an Apache helicopter, put on the internet by WikiLeaks, proves the point. 2 Reuters journalists were killed, and 2 children were wounded after the helicopter opened fire.
We are all in this together, and even though that sounds laughably simple well, it's like Orwell said. It would be pretentious to expound on the ideas of Hillman, but what is dangerous about the Greeks might easily be missed, like gulping down food, failing to thoroughly chew and so swallowing a shard of glass. This documentary, put together by dangerous men, carries several mean-spirited shards that are aimed at our gut-level understanding of our world. It's impossible to know if the creators of the Greeks were consciously aiming at an archetypal hit on their intended audience, but a lot of care and money went into making their points. In his first essay in The Myth of Analysis on psychological creativity, Hillman discusses soul, anima, and psyche, symbols of the feminine. Hillman writes, "Soul is not a scientific term, and it appears rarely in psychology today, and then usually with inverted commas, as if to keep it from infecting its scientifically sterile surround. Soul," he writes, "refers to that unknown human factor which makes meaning possible, which turns events into experiences, which is communicated in love, and which has a religious concern. For your information, ligament and religion share a common root, the lig, that which holds together. Events into experiences." Hillman writes about the popular ideas of creativity, the artist and the common person, the idea that creativity belongs to or is the domain of the artist. Why can't the common man change his heroically romantic 19th century concept of genius, so charged with ambition and envy, and be done with this fantasy of the extraordinary personality? Has not each of us a genius? Has not each genius a human soul? Hillman goes on to say that at least one form of the creative is continuously open for each of us, psychological creativity. If you aren't a poet, as Jung says, perhaps you can create yourself. The word genius comes from the Latin and means a guiding spirit or tutelary deity of a person, family, or place. It may have been through Hillman that I read that genius has to do with the hearth, the guiding spirit of that very humble place in the home. When that genius within is given truthful expression, then our creativity and the art of our lives graces the world. Ostensibly about the Athenian Greeks, this documentary attempts to destroy our faith in our genius, doing it through its attack on women, the arts, and the mind and soul itself.
For men, life was passed working in the fields or in basic crafts. Women spent their days cloistered in the home, cooking, spinning, weaving. Greeks would travel hundreds of miles to attend the Olympics. And during the festival, the land surrounding the stadiums would be covered with encampments. But the games were very much a male experience. Women were prohibited from entering the competitions or even the stadium. The Athenians were now looking for a leader who might fulfill their newfound sense of imperial glory. They found a man who seemed the perfect reflection of this new ideal. A man named Pericles, a man who would change the face of Athens forever.
There's probably not a more important figure in the history of classical Greece than Pericles. He was the leader of Athens at the height of its power and of its artistic achievement. He was the figure associated appropriately with bringing Athenian democracy to its climax, to its height.
But Pericles was no obvious democrat like Themistocles, for he had been born into one of Athens' most elite families. And perhaps because of his aristocratic origins, Pericles knew what the people of Athens now wanted: a city fit to rule an empire.
It seems clear that Pericles had in mind to create a city whose greatness would be admired by the people who lived there, by everybody else in the Greek world, well into the future.
Pericles announced a glorious new vision to the Athenian assembly.
Have you noticed this? In some American films and documentaries, a British accent is a shorthand for classy or educated. Even a character who is German and a Nazi may sound like a high-toned Brit.
All kinds of enterprises should be created which will provide inspiration for every art, find employment for every hand. We must devote ourselves to acquiring things that will be the source of everlasting fame.
James Hillman writes about fame. In Roman and Renaissance times, fama, or reputation, was imagined to be like an invisible accompanying spirit, one's own genius passed to one by one's ancestors. It was more precious than one's own life, to be served, honored, enhanced by one's actions, and kept untarnished. Its lasting benefits passed on to one's heirs, descending to future generations with the family crest and name.
He proposed a massive reconstruction plan, At its center would be a new Parthenon, a temple to Athena, and it would be one of the most astonishing buildings of the ancient world.
This new construction program was of unprecedented magnitude and expense. The Parthenon in particular was extraordinarily expensive. It was filled with all sorts of architectural refinements.
Pericles planned to spend over 5,000 talents in the first year alone. A total budget of more than $1 billion in today's terms.
Pericles was directly involved in the planning process.
Some protested that he was decking out the city like a prostitute. Prostitute. But when the building was completed in only 15 years, his critics were silenced. Even Pericles' partner, a woman named Aspasia, was unique and distinguished. Pericles had divorced his wife and set up home with a foreign woman, a woman whose occupation was hardly to be expected. For Aspasia was what was known as a hetaira, Greek for a companion.
Yes, she was, in a technical sense, I guess, a prostitute. Yes, she was, in a technical sense, I guess, a prostitute, but she was more than that, a woman of charm, of style, of intellect. She really was very extraordinary. She had an extraordinary mind.
This relationship caused scandal throughout Athens, not just because of Aspasia's profession, but because Pericles treated her as an equal, something deeply unusual in 5th century Athens.
One of the things that created such a stir was that Pericles had her participate in conversations that he had with some of the most important individuals with whom he talked. There's jokes to suggest that Aspasia actually was the person who wrote Pericles' speeches.
Those in the ancient world who despised everything the Persians stood for. One custom that both fascinated and appalled the Greeks was the Persian feast.
Most of what we know about Persian feasts, of course, comes from the Greek sources, because the Greeks are so interested or fascinated by this concept of luxury that obviously feasting is going to be an element of that luxurious lifestyle. Persian feasts are going to be opulent, all the kind of things which are always associated with luxury.
Drinking was an essential part of the Persian feast. Herodotus wrote, "The Persians are very fond of wine, and no one is allowed to vomit or urinate in the presence of another person."
The Persians seem to live by this principle of telling the truth. That's something that actually the Greeks begrudgingly admire in them. And they use drinking as a rather political system. The Persians tend to get very drunk because only in drink do you tell the truth. So, you know, you have your political discretion, you drink a lot, things get said, then everybody goes to bed and mulls it over, wakes up the next day with a hangover, and then everybody comes back together again to have the same conversation to see if they still have those kind of ideas.
Like many Persian traditions, feasting was not luxury for luxury's sake. It had an important social role.
Feasting brings you together as a community. They are all partaking of the same food and of the same experience, so it's a great uniting thing.
Yet to the Greeks, it was another example of why the Persians were an inferior race. Alexander the Great warned his own soldiers that gluttony and opulence lead to much unmanliness.
What the Greek sources like to play up is this idea that the Persians are luxurious, effeminized, luxury-loving, effeminizing race of no-gooders, really, who are over there somewhere in the east, and they are corrupting us and our morals and all that we stand for.
The Persians may have built great cities and gardens, but they were still essentially a nomadic people.
This kind of nomadic feeling always remained with the Persians, despite the fact that they built these vast imperial cities. They were as at home in a city as they were in a tent.
For the Greeks, The Persians' nomadic lifestyle was a cause for mockery. Like modern nomads, the ancient Persians spent the winter months tending their herds on the plains and the hot summer months in the cool of the mountains. To the Greeks, this escape from the summer heat was evidence of Persian unmanliness.
The Greeks like to criticize the Persians for this softness. They see them as rather hot and moist creatures. And the other thing that Greeks see as hot and moist are women. This is the way that women's bodies works. If women are hot and moist, and therefore Persians are hot and moist, they must be one and the same thing, basically. Persians are not real men because they can't stand the heat.
I said, hey, you, apple my cloud. Hey, you, apple my cloud.
Here in the shadow of the Acropolis sits the world's first theatre. Twice a year, the Athenian population would gather here to watch a great festival. A festival of drama, television, cinema, theatre, all owe their existence to this place. For here is the home of popular entertainment.
There's one huge difference between the ancient theatre and our own, and that is that it was incredibly noisy. We hear stories of how when they didn't like a play, the audience booed and they hissed and they actually got actors driven off the stage. But there's other stories that showed that when they were going with the story and deeply involved in it, they actually all collectively burst into tears.
The favourite tales of the Greek stage were called tragedies. These were stories as shocking as a contemporary horror movie. The tragedies told stories of great men falling from their heights, losing everything they owned. These tragedies have fascinated audiences ever since. This 19th century painting shows the story of the mythical ruler Agamemnon, who was murdered by his own wife. Another tragedy told of King Oedipus, who gouged out his eyes when he discovered that he had married his own mother. These Athenians, natives of the greatest city in the ancient world, seemed to revel in seeing how frail greatness could really be.
I don't think we can use Greek tragedy to tell us exactly what happened in reality. It's not a document of Athenian social life. But what it does do is take us directly and immediately into the psychological heart of those Athenian men. The kind of dreams and fantasies and fears and imaginary scenarios that they came up with in the theatre have to tell us just as much about them as any document of everyday reality could.
But Pericles would now risk everything he and the Athenians had built in one great gamble. A war. Finally, after 6 months of lingering illness, Pericles died in 429 BC. Pericles had planned to make Athens into the Mediterranean's greatest power, but his carefully calculated strategy had brought only disease and death.
Pericles simply underestimated the degree to which some things are out of the control of the very best intelligence and the very best knowledge that there are.
The Greeks throws the viewer some subtle stuff, notwithstanding the hatchet job of Greek theater. Modern horror movie indeed. The series not only keeps women in their unimportant place, but goes out of its way to link women to prostitutes, murderous creatures, and vectors of incest. In the neoliberal world, this is an important part of the ignorance that helps keep the machine of power and profit running smoothly. It is one of the most powerful weapons in their arsenal because masculine-feminine is rooted in archetypal realities, and we moderns are the product of over 2,500 years of psychological conditioning about the meanings of man and woman and their proper place in the smooth running of culture. And because we tend to respond unconsciously, without awareness, to symbols, we're mostly bits of cloth fluttering in the breezes. Here's something interesting. The Greeks, in looking at the arts, showed viewers pottery making in the Parthenon, but, except in passing, there was nothing about Grecian sculpture. My guess is that the omission is for the same reason that pederasty as a part of Athenian culture was omitted. After all, if they displayed naked men and women with breasts and genitals, they would have lost their audience. And this audience was the audience of the future, as I'll discuss in the next installment when we look at Socrates and how the Greeks assassinated his character and his importance.